So you're standing in the middle of nowhere. No GPS, no compass, no smartphone with a little arrow telling you which way to go. You're just a human, probably wearing animal skins, and you need to get home before it gets dark because, let's be honest, the dark was terrifying back then. How did ancient humans manage this? How did they navigate across entire continents without any of the tools we consider absolutely essential? The answer is way more fascinating than you'd think, and it involves everything from the stars above your head to the dirt beneath your feet. Let's start with the most obvious one that everyone forgets about until you actually need it: the sun. I know, it sounds almost too simple, but hear me out. Ancient humans were absolutely obsessed with the sun. They watched it rise in the east and set in the west every single day, and they used this information like we use Google Maps. They didn't just watch it casually either. They studied its patterns so intensely that they could predict seasonal changes based on exactly where the sun rose on the horizon. In places like Australia, Aboriginal peoples developed incredibly sophisticated solar navigation systems. They could literally tell time, determine direction, and predict seasons all by observing the sun's movement throughout the year. That's not just navigation, that's practical astronomy without a telescope. But here's where it gets really wild. The sun is great during the day, sure, but what about night? Well, ancient humans looked up at the stars, and they basically created the world's first star charts using their own brains. They didn't have telescopes or fancy equipment, they had eyeballs and an insane amount of patience. The Polynesians are probably the most famous example of this, and honestly, they might be the greatest navigators in human history. They didn't have any written navigation systems. No maps, no journals, nothing. They memorized entire star patterns and used them to navigate across the Pacific Ocean. The distances we're talking about are absolutely mental. They traveled from Southeast Asia all the way to Easter Island, which is literally one of the most remote places on Earth. That's roughly 7,000 miles across open ocean, in wooden canoes, without instruments, with just the stars above their heads and the waves beneath their feet. They didn't navigate by just looking at one star either. They used what's called a star compass, except it was all in their head. They memorized which stars rose and set at specific points on the horizon. They knew that if they followed this star path, it would lead them to a specific island. If they deviated from the star path, they adjusted. It was like having GPS, except the satellite system was literally the universe, and the calculations were happening inside their brains in real time. Different Polynesian cultures had different star compass systems, but they all worked on the same principle. By observing the positions of over 150 different stars, they could create mental maps of the entire Pacific Ocean. That's approximately 165 million square kilometers, and they navigated it with their naked eyes and their memory. Now, let's talk about something that's equally impressive but way less romantic: the ocean itself. Waves. Seriously, waves. When Polynesians were out in the middle of the ocean, they didn't just look at the stars, they felt the waves. Different ocean currents create different wave patterns, and these patterns can actually be used for navigation. It's called wave piloting. When you're out in the open ocean, multiple swells are moving in different directions at different times. They create interference patterns, and experienced navigators can actually feel these patterns. They'd sit in their canoe and feel how the swells moved, and they'd use that information to determine their position and direction. This isn't metaphorical. This is real, practical navigation based on physical forces in the ocean. A modern study actually proved this works. Researchers tested wave piloting and found that it's remarkably accurate for navigation. You just need enough experience to know what you're feeling for. Polynesian wayfinders trained for years to develop this skill. They'd memorize wave patterns, practice identifying them in different conditions, and eventually they could navigate by feel. It's like how a skilled musician can hear a single instrument in an orchestra, or how an experienced chef can taste one ingredient in a complex dish. It's expertise taken to an extreme level, but what about land navigation? That's a different beast entirely. When humans were migrating across continents, they couldn't rely on stars or ocean waves. They needed different systems, and they developed them. One of the most remarkable navigation systems was developed by the Inca. The Inca Empire stretched across South America, covering roughly 2 million square kilometers. That's the size of Egypt. They built roads, yes, but they also developed an incredibly sophisticated understanding of landscape navigation. They used landmarks, terrain features, and mental maps to navigate across mountains, deserts, and rainforests. They didn't have written maps, but they had quipu, which was a system of knotted strings that could encode information, including navigational data. The Inca also used something called visual landmarks. They'd identify specific mountains, rock formations, or trees, and use them as navigation points. They'd travel from landmark to landmark like they were following a predetermined route. This might sound simple, but it required an absolutely insane amount of geographic knowledge. They had to memorize not just individual landmarks, but how they related to each other, how they appeared from different angles, and how to navigate between them even when visibility was poor. It's like they had mental 3D maps of their entire empire. Desert navigation is its own unique challenge, and the Bedouin peoples of the Arabian and Saharan deserts were masters at it. They navigated across seemingly endless expanses of sand using a combination of techniques. They observed the stars, obviously. They used the position of the sun, but they also used their sense of smell, their knowledge of wind patterns, the way sand felt beneath their feet, and even the behavior of animals. Different parts of the desert have different scents. If you've traveled through enough desert, you can actually recognize regions by smell. The wind patterns change at different times of year and different times of day, and experienced navigators could use these patterns to determine direction and predict weather changes. The Bedouin could also read the sand itself. The way sand dunes form, the direction they face, the patterns on their surfaces, all of this provided navigational information. There's also the matter of celestial mechanics that ancient humans understood without any formal education. They observed that certain stars never moved relative to the North Pole. Polaris, the North Star, essentially stays in the same spot throughout the night. Every other star rotates around it. For someone living in the Northern Hemisphere, the North Star is an incredibly reliable navigation tool. It always points north. It's like nature's built-in compass. Similarly, people in the Southern Hemisphere had no North Star, but they had the Southern Cross constellation, which also helped them determine latitude. These weren't accidental discoveries either. Ancient humans spent generations observing the night sky, documenting star positions, and developing increasingly sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The Chinese were tracking solar and lunar eclipses thousands of years ago. The Greeks were calculating the Earth's circumference using nothing but geometry and shadow lengths. The Indians developed mathematical systems that allowed them to predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy. This brings us to something really important. Navigation isn't just about direction, it's also about distance. Ancient humans needed to know not just which way to go, but how far they'd traveled. They used a variety of methods for this. Foot pacing or counting your steps is incredibly simple, but actually quite effective. If you know that your average stride is about 3 feet, and you count your steps, you can estimate how far you've traveled. Ancient peoples did this constantly. They'd count paces and remember them. Over time, they'd develop internal odometers. They could estimate distances with surprising accuracy. Another method was using landmarks at regular intervals. Travelers would identify waypoints and the distances between them. By traveling from waypoint to waypoint, they could gauge their progress. This was especially common along major trade routes. The Silk Road, for example, had way stations and landmarks that merchants used to navigate. They knew roughly how long it should take to travel between stations, and if they were taking too long, they knew something was wrong. Native Australians used songlines, which is absolutely one of the most incredible navigation systems ever developed. Songlines are basically songs that describe the landscape. Each song corresponds to a specific route through the Australian outback, and the lyrics contain navigational information encoded in metaphorical language. The songs describe landmarks, water sources, dangerous areas, and the direction of travel. By singing these songs and following the mental map they described, Aboriginal peoples could navigate across the vast Australian desert. The remarkable thing is that these songlines are thousands of years old, passed down orally through countless generations. They weren't written down. They were memorized and transmitted through song and storytelling. Anthropologists have confirmed that these songlines are accurate. They correspond to actual routes through the landscape, and following them will get you where you need to go. Fire was also important for navigation. Ancient peoples used fires as beacons. If you were trying to guide someone to your settlement, you'd light a fire at night, and they could see it from a distance. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Coastal peoples used beacon fires to guide ships. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary. You could communicate across distances without any technology whatsoever. Just fire and sight lines. Weather patterns were another crucial navigation tool. Different seasons brought different weather. The monsoons in Southeast Asia, for example, blow in predictable patterns. Sailors knew that if they sailed during the right season, they'd have favorable winds. They could actually use the weather to assist their navigation. Wind patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal changes were all observed and incorporated into navigation strategies. The Vikings, for example, used their knowledge of weather patterns and ocean currents to navigate the Atlantic. They understood that certain currents flowed in certain directions, and they used these currents to their advantage. There's also evidence that ancient peoples used magnetic stones for navigation. Lodestones, which are naturally magnetic, were known to point in a specific direction. There's debate about when exactly humans started using magnets for navigation, but there's strong evidence that Chinese navigators were using magnetic compasses by at least 1000 CE. However, even before the formal compass, people might have noticed that certain stones could point north, and they might have used this information intuitively. Birds were another navigation tool. Migratory birds follow the same routes every year. If you paid attention to bird behavior, you could predict seasonal changes and determine direction. Some birds navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, and it's possible that ancient humans noticed bird behavior correlated with direction and used it as a navigation aid. Additionally, the presence of certain bird species indicated that land was nearby, which was crucial for maritime navigation. Seabirds typically don't venture too far from land, so seeing them indicated you were approaching shore. Sound was also used for navigation. In foggy or low visibility conditions, people used sound to navigate. They'd listen for waves crashing on rocks, or they'd use bells and horns to keep track of multiple boats. Blind individuals navigated using echolocation, making sounds, and listening to how they bounced off obstacles. While humans aren't as good at echolocation as bats, it's still a viable navigation method in certain conditions. The sense of smell, as mentioned with the Bedouin, was more important than modern people realize. Different environments have different scents. Forests smell different from deserts. Areas near water smell different from arid areas. Experienced travelers could literally smell their way to destinations. This sounds absurd to modern people with our noses adapted to ignoring most smells, but for ancient peoples whose senses were more developed, smell was an important part of environmental awareness and navigation. Memory itself was the greatest navigation tool. Ancient peoples didn't need written maps because they had the maps stored in their heads. They could memorize incredibly complex routes, landmarks, and navigational information. The Aboriginal songlines are an example of this, but there were many other oral navigation systems. Polynesian navigators memorized star compasses. Inca navigators memorized landscape features. Trade merchants memorized routes and waypoints. This isn't to say they had photographic memories, they didn't. Instead, they developed memory techniques and mnemonic devices that allowed them to store and retrieve large amounts of spatial information. Some of these memory techniques were incredibly sophisticated. The method of loci, sometimes called the memory palace technique, was documented in ancient Rome and Greece, but it was likely used long before that. The idea is simple, but effective. You mentally walk through a familiar place and you place images or information at specific locations along your walk. To remember the information later, you mentally retrace your steps. This works remarkably well for storing spatial information, which is perfect for navigation. Time was another crucial component of navigation. Ancient peoples had incredibly accurate internal clocks. They knew what time of day it was based on the sun's position and shadows. They knew what season it was based on the position of stars and celestial events. They could predict tides based on the moon's phases. This temporal awareness was as important as directional awareness. If you knew what time it was, you could estimate where the sun would be and therefore what direction to travel. Actually, let's talk more about tides. Coastal peoples had incredibly sophisticated understanding of tidal patterns. They knew that tides followed the moon's cycles. They could predict when high tide would occur based on the lunar calendar. They used tides for navigation because tidal currents can actually push boats in specific directions. By timing their travel to coincide with favorable tides, they could cover distances more efficiently. The timing had to be precise, but experienced navigators could do it. Maritime navigation in particular required understanding currents, winds, and tides simultaneously. A ship might sail with the wind, but against the current, requiring the navigator to calculate which force would dominate and adjust accordingly. This required mathematical thinking without formal mathematics. It required observation, pattern recognition, and the ability to integrate multiple variables into a coherent navigation strategy. The Polynesians were doing calculus without knowing they were doing calculus. They were making predictions based on complex systems, running experiments, and refining their methods based on results. The accuracy achieved by ancient navigators is honestly shocking when you think about it. Polynesians navigated across millions of square kilometers with error rates that would be considered acceptable even with modern instruments. The Inca maintained an empire spanning 2 million square kilometers without written maps or formal navigation instruments. The Romans built roads that connected the entire Mediterranean region. The Chinese navigated the Indian Ocean and the coasts of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula using nothing but stars, ocean knowledge, and mathematical calculations. What's really important to understand is that ancient navigation wasn't luck. It wasn't random guessing that happened to work out sometimes. It was systematic. It was based on observation, analysis, and decades of accumulated knowledge. Different cultures developed different systems, but all of them were rooted in careful observation of the natural world. They noticed patterns. They tested hypotheses. They refined their methods. They documented their findings, either in written form or through oral traditions. This is science. This is empirical knowledge gathering and practical application. Modern navigation technology is incredible, but it's also fragile. If your GPS satellite fails, you're lost. If your compass gets damaged, you can't navigate. If your phone dies, you're in trouble. Ancient peoples didn't have these vulnerabilities. Their navigation systems were redundant. If they couldn't see the stars because of clouds, they could use waves and wind. If they couldn't use the sun, they could use landmarks. If they couldn't recognize landmarks, they could use celestial mechanics. Every navigation system had backups, and the backups had backups. This is actually more robust than modern technology in some ways. There's also something almost poetic about ancient navigation. Modern navigation is mediated through technology. You're looking at a screen that's showing you a map generated by satellites. You're not actually engaged with the landscape. You're not observing the sun's position, or feeling the waves, or smelling the air. Ancient navigation demanded constant engagement with the environment. You had to be present. You had to be observant. You had to be in relationship with the natural world. In a way, ancient navigators understood their landscape better than modern people understand theirs. They didn't just know the route. They knew why the route worked. They understood the mechanics of navigation at a level that most modern people couldn't even conceptualize. And here's something really wild. Some ancient navigation techniques are still used today. Polynesian wayfinding is experiencing a revival. Modern sailors are relearning star navigation and wave piloting. It turns out that these ancient techniques are not just historically interesting. They're practically effective. They work. They're being used in educational programs, cultural preservation efforts, and even in adventure navigation. Because when push comes to shove, when technology fails and you're truly lost, knowing how to navigate using the stars and the ocean is more valuable than any GPS device. One fascinating aspect that deserves more attention is the role of training and apprenticeship in ancient navigation. These skills weren't innate. They were learned over years of dedicated practice. Young navigators would apprentice under experienced wayfinders, learning through observation and hands-on practice. They'd make mistakes, learn from them, and gradually develop expertise. The knowledge transfer happened through direct instruction, storytelling, and repetition. A young Polynesian navigator might spend a decade learning before being trusted to lead an expedition. That's a serious commitment to mastery. The knowledge held by these ancient navigators was incredibly specialized. They weren't just learning to get from point A to point B, they were developing deep understanding of atmospheric conditions, oceanic phenomena, astronomical patterns, and landscape features. This wasn't superficial knowledge, it was profound expertise. The documentation of navigation knowledge also varied across cultures. While the Polynesians used oral tradition and the Inca used quipu, other cultures developed written navigation manuals. The Portolan charts used by Mediterranean sailors during the medieval period were detailed maps that showed coastlines, ports, and sailing routes. These charts were passed down and improved over generations. They represented accumulated knowledge from countless voyages. Norse sagas contained navigation information encoded in poetic language. Viking explorers would memorize these sagas before embarking on journeys. Every culture had methods for preserving and transmitting navigation knowledge, adapted to their cultural practices and available technologies. Navigation also reveals something profound about how ancient peoples understood space and geography. They didn't think of the world the way we do, as a flat map viewed from above. They thought of it as a network of routes and landmarks, places connected by stories and experiences. Their geographic knowledge was embedded in narrative and practice, not abstracted into objective coordinates. This different way of understanding space was perfectly functional for their purposes. It allowed them to navigate vast distances and maintain accurate mental maps of regions they traveled. The integration of multiple navigation systems created redundancy and reliability. If one system failed, others provided backup information. This is actually a principle that modern navigation systems try to replicate. GPS works well, but it can be jammed or blocked. Multiple positioning systems create a more resilient overall system. Ancient navigators had figured this out intuitively thousands of years ago. They didn't rely on single methods. They cross-checked information using multiple systems simultaneously. The bottom line is this: ancient humans weren't less intelligent than us. They weren't bumbling around randomly hoping not to get lost. They were scientists and engineers and artists all rolled into one. They observed the world carefully. They developed sophisticated systems for understanding it. They passed this knowledge down through generations. They refined their methods through trial and error. They navigated across continents and oceans with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but their brains and their senses. They understood their world in ways that we modern people, with all our technology and convenience, might never fully comprehend. This is the story of human ingenuity, persistence, and our fundamental desire to explore.